problem with Paul's opponents in the letter to the Philippians is that Paul probably refers to hostility from various groups he's up against in Ephesus. This could include civic authorities, it could include pagan critics, it could include local Jewish leaders and maybe rival Jewish Christian believers and their Gentile converts. We've got to remember that Paul and his team may not have been the first Christian group to settle in Ephesus. There may have been other Christian groups that got to Ephesus. It's very likely that part of the Johannine circle also got to Ephesus, and maybe there were other Jewish Christian people who got there as well, and they had their own cohort of Gentile converts. Nijay Gupta and I discussed this at length in our Philippians commentary, which you can check out if you like. But I do think it's very hard to pin down exactly who Paul's opponents are, because he describes them like at 4 different points, and they're all described very differently. Are they rivals who preach Christ? Are they more, antinomian libertines? It's hard to say who they are. So it's hard to pin Paul's rhetoric, which, sometimes can be exaggerated and stereotypical. It's hard to pin them down against a precise group, whether they're like pagans, Jews, or Jewish Christians, or even, as Novenson alleges, Gentile Christian proselytes. Furthermore, I do not think that proselytizers, whether Jewish or Gentile, have arrived in Philippi yet. So what Paul says in Philippians 3 about watch out for those dogs, those mutilators, those bad workers, I think it's still somewhat hypothetical, but Paul is worried that some of the people he's encountered in Ephesus or Galatia or Antioch may end up also in Philippi and hassle his churches there. Where Novenson is interesting is he wants to make a strong comparison or strong contrast between 2 Corinthians 11 verses 22 to 29 and Philippians 3 to 4. Now, in both of those texts, 2 Corinthians 11 and Philippians 3, Paul does lay out his Jewish credentials. He talks about how I'm a Hebrew, I'm an Israelite, all that kind of thing. Novenson believes this, and this is interesting. He says, in 2 Corinthians 11:22, Paul emphasizes his equality with the super apostles. That's in 2 Corinthians. But in Philippians 3, he stresses his superiority to the bad workers. And this is what Novenson says. He says, the super apostles in Corinth are natural-born Jews like Paul. The bad workers in Philippians, by contrast, are Gentile posers. In other words, he says, Paul doesn't say, are they an Israelite? So am I. Are they a Hebrew? So am I, where he's saying how equal they are. In Philippians 3, Paul says, well, you're going to talk about being Jewish? Well, I'm Jewish. I was born a Jew, I was circumcised on the 8th day. Not later in life as an adult. I was circumcised as a child. I was zealous for the law and everything. So that would indicate he's showing he's more Jewish than these recently circumcised Gentiles. Maybe, but I've got a few doubts, okay? I think if you look at the argument that Paul makes in both cases, I think it's actually the other way around. I think in 2 Corinthians 11, Paul stresses not his equality to the super apostles, but his superiority. Now, he says literally, I am better. That's a clear argument that he thinks he's better than them. Now, what Novenson would say is, that only comes to the comparison of the list of trials on his ethnic religious stuff. That's where he says he's equal. But I think Paul's betterness applies to everything he says. So I think Paul is saying that he is superior to the super apostles. And in Philippians 3, what I think he's doing is saying, look, if these agitators, intruders, these bad hombres do rock up, my inherited Jewish privileges are just as good as theirs. The difference is not his superiority in degree of Jewishness. The difference is he considers all of his inherited Jewish privileges to be loss for the sake of knowing Christ. That's what I think the difference is. So I would probably compare Philippians 3 and 2